So our first panel of the day is on resource recovery regulatory pathways. We're very grateful to Kai Udert for helping moderate this panel, and he'll be introducing the panelists who are in that. So I'll hand it over to you, Kai, and bring our computer over to Pat Lando, who we have here in person for the panel as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And yeah, good morning to the US. It's good afternoon here. I think it's a really great topic, and I'm happy that I can actually moderate this panel discussion. Regulations, regulatory pathways in resource recovery. So that's basically the topic of our panel discussion. I would like to start with the introduction of the participants. Maybe I'll start with myself, me as a moderator. So my name is Kai Udert. I'm at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, better known as EAWAC. I have been working on urine source separation for more than 25 years, basically, developing technologies, but also on some regulatory work I've done as well internationally and also in Switzerland. Our panelists, I would like to start with the introduction of Alexandra Jeschke. Alexandra is an architect and an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Texas in Austin. She holds a Doctor of Design degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a diploma from the Architectural Association in London. And recently, and that's important actually for our panel discussion, a book of hers was published, which has the name The Greening of America's Building Codes, Promises and Paradoxes. The book is actually based on her doctoral thesis. The next panelist I want to introduce is Pat, who we actually see here. Hi, Pat. Pat Lando is the Executive Director of RECODE. RECODE is an Oregon-based nonprofit organization which aims to develop codes, laws, and policies to ensure equitable access to water, sanitation, and food systems that are resilient to climate change and other forces. So something that we actually all familiar with and really motivated by. He has been a member of many committees and commissions aiming at resource-oriented sanitation and water reuse. He's also a co-founder of a company called Nutrient Recovery Services, which is a manufacturer of a USDA-certified fertilizer from urine. Then our third panelist, it's Matthew Leppincott. Matthew is a technical writer who has worked on the reform of building mechanical codes since 2010. He led writing the chapter on composting and urine diverting toilets in the Water Efficiency and Sanitation Standard, WESTAND, by the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials. I think we will get back to this standard several times during this discussion. Currently, he's working at the University of Michigan, focusing on regulatory pathways for urine diversion in the state of Michigan. And last but not least, John Lansing. John is a lead plumbing designer at PAE, a consulting engineering firm in Portland. John specializes in applying sustainable solutions to plumbing systems and research on international engineering design guidance. He serves on technical committees for the Water Efficiency and Sanitation Standard, again, the WESTAND, and for the ICC 815 standard for sizing water distribution, sanitary drainage, and vent piping systems. And I was actually lucky to meet John while he was visiting EAWAC on his tour through Europe to get familiar with actually what's going on here in Europe. Now, very quickly, how do we want to do this panel discussion? There are a lot of topics we could actually discuss, and we only have about 55 minutes from now on, and we already discussed before we started with this panel discussion how we can organize it. I wrote down some topics I would like to address, and I think during the panel discussion there will be other topics coming up. If you have any questions, please raise your hand so that I can see and address that. And this is also the case for the panelists as well. Okay, let's start maybe with a question to Alexandra. And Alexandra, in your book, you present the concept of pre-design and the risk of foreclosing options in architecture. Maybe can you elaborate a little bit on this concept and how it relates to our topic here, resource-oriented sanitation?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm a little bit nervous because I'm not an expert, technically speaking, in the topic that you are trying to really basically resolve as a technical issue. But being an architect, what you do is very often, what people like you do is very often overlooked by architects. So what I try to do in my research and my book, in part, was to actually draw the attention of architects and students of architecture to this phase that precedes design. And I call it pre-design. It's a term that is sometimes used in our field, but I thought it was really appropriate because it allowed me to focus architects' attention on the type of decision making that happens before we even make the first click, or before we would say draw the first line. And so as part of my research, I had the pleasure of actually interviewing Matthew Lippincott for one of my chapters, and discovering all the incredible work that goes on before architects are given a chance to design a building. And so, as I said, for you, that's going to be probably an obvious thing. But I think what I'd like to emphasize is the fact that it's incredibly important to keep on talking to architects and reminding them of the existence of this field, because most of us are, number one, not really interested because we are so overwhelmed by everything that we need to address during the design that we just don't have the patience. But also, and I think really importantly, students of architecture are not aware of the fact that this is an avenue that they could pursue as a professional path. So what I do in the book is try to expose architects not just to issues related to plumbing and topics we're talking about today, but things like simulation software and writing of model codes, which is what Matthew is right now doing with Pat, and that's how I met Matthew through Recode. So I think that's a really important point, but it goes, I think, also in the opposite direction. It's very important for your community, I think, to pay attention to the limited vision that the architects have of these issues, and keep on making sure that you not assume their interest or their understanding or engagement, potential engagement in the resolution of these topics. So maybe that's kind of like, and I don't know if that answers your question or you want me to elaborate on anything. I don't want to take too much time, but as a kind of stage for the conversation, that's what I wanted to say. And I think that what's really important for architects to understand is that the regulations are not something that is fixed, and that people like you who are constantly working on it, even if the time is much longer, the timeline is much longer than what we used to when it comes to designing a project. So I think that's also really important, and most, at least students, most architects who are focused on design, very often, formally driven, but not only, they just not aware of that.
So, I mean, you say we should engage architects early on, and they actually communicate with architects as well. But let's assume we have a young architect. He or she is really exciting about having a urine separation system in a new house, a new building. Are we ready in the US to integrate it? I mean, are the regulations ready, or what is missing from your point of view? I mean, what do we have to work on? And we have to familiarize them with the concept and the idea of nutrient recovery, but what else is actually missing?
I think that it really depends on where we are, and I'm sure the other panelists will be able to be more specific on that. But as you all know, in this country, the code is not exactly the same for every single city or state. So depending on where you are, it might be a viable option, but it might also not be a viable option. And so that's the first step, even finding out whether that's something that is possible. and how easy it is, because sometimes it's very easy because it's already incorporated maybe in the code, but in other places it's kind of hidden somewhere and there's some kind of a back way into it, but you have to be really persistent and patient to find it. And so I think exposing architects to the work of such organizations as Recode, at least for me, that was really telling. It opened my eyes and helped me understand what was going out there, and also what other people went through in order to achieve their goals. And so this kind of platforms, I think, are really important as a way to find answers, quicker and learn from others. Trials and errors, that very often architects feel very isolated in this kind of situations, because there are not many of them maybe who want to deal with it. And honestly, the other thing is that it seems such a technical issue that most architects might not understand that many decisions need to be perhaps made very early. They cannot be left to the last moment, because they might be foreclosing certain possibilities, technically speaking. And so explaining to them what those early decisions are is very important. Now, I don't want to talk about the details, because I'm sure someone else here is better equipped to do that. But it happens often that we don't quite understand that something like a toilet needs to be considered so early, because it has repercussions that have to do with many things that are not actually localized in the toilet itself, let's say.
I mean, this also means that you have to work together with planning companies, consulting companies who are really familiar with those systems. You mentioned several times Recode. Maybe, Pat, could you elaborate on how Recode actually supports or can support architects, maybe also consultants? How do you do that with your work? You're muted.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
It's always got to be one in a session, right? Yeah, to sort of follow up on that, I'll give an example. I guess that's the best way to do it. City of Santa Monica wanted to put a new building in. It was going to achieve living building status. So in that case, it wanted to be water independent, including the sanitation. They knew they wanted to likely have to put in a composting toilet or an ecological sanitation system of some sort. There was a big question and an unknown of how to do that, what rules and regulations they'd have to go through, what sort of fixtures they could use. So there was a placeholder there for a long time. The developer, the owner, that was the City of Santa Monica, knew the risks that would happen. So from the very beginning, you sort of have a pathway of normalcy, right? We could put in a standard toilet and we could still build the building. The next level up, you sort of have sort of a risk based sort of approach. Well, we could put in, a fully disconnected system. We could put in a modified system, and you have sort of pathways and a timeline of when you need to make those decisions to keep it in the project, or it needs to go away. In the case of the Santa Monica project, they really wanted to put in a specific device and a specific toilet. None of those achieved the NSF rating that they needed to put in. And so they ended up having to fall back on sort of a standard approach. And that was saved until the very end. And so I guess the approach in that case is one, what Alexandria was talking about is when you start the project, you really want permit certainty. And where you can't find permit certainty, then you have to set up a series of sort of landmark dates and approaches to still try to achieve sort of this goal that you want. And then also have a pathway for certainty. And so that's kind of a typical approach of a project from sort of adopting new things into the project, whether that's yard reuse or ecological sanitation. It could be cross-laminated timber buildings. It could be anything. And so that's the approach you take.
And this recode, what do you provide to the architects? What's your specific, I mean, how can you help them? I mean, because you're working on coding basically, regulations. Can you provide them with, okay, we have this state law here or this regulation here, you can use that. Also in the discussions with the administration, how do you proceed?
Yeah, so we do a lot of research to find, is there a pathway that's already on the books? Is there another project that had done this, maybe under alternative means and methods or under an experimental permit? Are there other examples in other jurisdictions, either within the same state or county, or are there national standards or international standards that have been used? So if you do have to go through an experimental or alternative means and methods process for the project, then you have all that supporting document. And typically with that supporting document, you have the scientific background to support it as well. And so that's kind of the services that we would do, focused around water reuse, sanitation, and nutrient recovery.
So when it comes to regulations, and this is actually a question for John, I mean, there is also a lot of really detailed regulations about piping diameters, traps, and so on, and toilets, and so on. And how is the situation in the US? Are we ready to install, let's say, source separation toilets and piping, or what is missing? Where are we standing with the regulations?
I would say to that, absolutely, we are ready. Do we have things to learn? Also, yes, I think that we're going to find that there's certain aspects for design guidance and regulation that need to be updated and modified as we move along and see more installations in place. And I also want to speak to Alexandra's comments on having the architect involved early on. It's just so important to have that support, because it's the architect that's really communicating with the consulting engineer, the contractor, and the owner and the investors, and having the architect being this something that they're interested in as far as urine separation or source separation, nutrient recovery, absolutely essential for overcoming these hurdles that come along the way. Because the bottom line is, when you're doing a building like this, it involves breaking a lot of rules, and breaking rules is fine sometimes if there's a reason. If we wanted to, I don't know, not put a backflow preventer on a building, or not put an emergency egress into a building, there's no good reason for that, right? However, if you have a reason for breaking the rules and you outline how it doesn't compromise human safety or well-being, or maybe even improves, then often you'll get support. And having those examples, like the construction of the PAE living building in Portland, having the Bullitt Center in Seattle was essential for moving forward with that, because we had that example for anyone that was, I would say, reasonably skeptical of some approaches, to come and look at some of the pathways that we did there. So the more examples we get, the more we can learn and build from that. So yes, we are absolutely ready.
So this is really, a plaidoyer for lighthouse projects. We need certain lighthouse projects where we can actually show that it works. Then we need those niches where we are allowed to do this, although there might not be the regulation in place yet, or not the proper regulation. This is correct. So we need a close collaboration with the city authorities on that. Maybe there was a comment here by A.B. Cohen, And what is still missing in the US, that's the regulation on land application. So that's something else. This is how can we actually use the urine as a fertilizer? And maybe I want to hand over this question to Matthew, because Matthew, you sent us this really nice overview of all these different regulations which are in place and which are actually needed. And I think it shows very nicely how complex the whole scene actually is. Matthew, when it
Sure.
comes to application of fertilizers?
Yes.
who would decide?
Let me put up that chart just for a second, or
Yeah.
well, if you could turn on screen sharing, I can do that. I'll talk about it for a second. So yeah, that there are a large number of rules around what can be applied to the land, and they're very disparate. They cover multiple federal agencies, and they also have this structure where you have federal mandates and federal guidance that then trickles down to state agencies that create their own policies and programs that must be as strict or stricter than the federal standards. So see if we take a look at this. Oh, it won't let me do it. Okay. Well,
Okay.
I'll just talk about it.
Mm.
So, within that system, I think one of the big challenges is finding regulators who are willing to work on creating new pathways, because you have these interlinked structures of authority that don't necessarily talk to each other. And so the state is always worried about the federal oversight, and the federal oversight maybe is not funded to make rule changes, and the county is worried about the state. And so I think unpacking that and finding especially regulators such as I know in Vermont, you have a wonderful head of the Amen, head of their on-site the residuals department, who's been willing to make permits for the Rich Earth Institute, who's been willing to kind of put his own imprimatur and make a regulatory judgment. And I think that's the hardest thing, is getting someone to make that regulatory judgment. The other difficult thing is finding places to make changes to the regulations. And so there are a couple different pathways that could be taken with the sanitation side. And I think the most pertinent question for us is, what is urine? And we all know what urine is, but there is no legal definition of urine. And this is something that Recode and Rich Earth worked together on creating the Gold Ribbon Commission on urine diversion and Pat has been leading a process to kind of create a federal, or not a federal, a national blueprint for what urine is that could trickle into some of these regulations. But yeah, so who will regulate urine? Where does it belong? And whether it's on a state or federal level are all open questions right now. And those are challenging for everyone in this field.
So you emphasize the importance of local decision makers, political decision makers. Is this the way to go at the moment? I mean, is there always a loophole to get something done in this way, or?
Well, what I would say is that there's a lot of leeway for interpretation because of the vagaries of the rules and the fact that the word urine appears nowhere.
Yeah.
So I would say at the state level is where the change is going to happen right now, because I don't think there is the funding or will at a federal level to revisit rules right now. There is pressure within the biosolids industry from the wastewater industry to make change on those rules and create new categories on a federal level. And the Water Environment Federation did a listening program with regulators, and they identified as their number 2 priority that those rules were too strict in preventing new technologies. But urine may or may not be a biosolid according to the federal government. I don't think those rules are a good fit myself.
Okay.
But there are also state solid waste rules. You know, a lot of different wastes have their own individual regulatory categories in states to be reused, and I think urine could be subject to those rulemakings at a state level.
Yeah. Pat, there was a really concrete question about your fertilizer where you got the USDA license. How did you do that? So you got the USDA certification.
Well, for clarification, we actually have, it's Oregon USDA.
Okay.
So it's specific to Oregon.
Okay.
And the system down at PAE is actually, it's the whole ecological sanitation. The part that's really permitted through the Department of Environmental Quality is the composting toilets, which of course has leachate in it. That's all has to be treated and then ultimately land applied. The urine system, so it falls underneath that, but the DEQ is fine with us taking that material and transforming that into a fertilizer, as far as not necessarily an official disposal mechanism, but they're not restricting us from doing that. On the Oregon USDA, they have requirements over testing. So we do testing to show what's in it and what is not in it, essentially. And we file that on a regular basis, and we keep track of the temperatures that we achieve. So things like, killing pathogens and limiting what's actually in the fertilizer. And then we basically go through the same thing any fertilizer manufacturer would have to go through, essentially.
Okay.
So there's not necessarily a handoff between DEQ and USDA when it comes to this material. So according to one, it's underneath their purview, right? And they're just they're not necessarily tracking the total volume coming out of there and land apply. And they're basically giving us an allowance to take the leachate or take the raw urine and transform that into a fertilizer. That's kind of the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah. Alexandra, you raised your hand. You're muted.
Now it's me. Sorry about that. One point, or rather a question to clarify, because in the chat there's comments about the difference between a waste and resource, which of course is very important, like how we treat urine. But when you talk about turning it into a fertilizer, I think it's also important, at least from like the point of view of an architect, to know like where it's going to go. Is it going to go off-site? And therefore we need a mechanism to transport it safely somewhere, or are we talking about using it on site? And then at that point it goes beyond building codes, right? It starts being related to municipal zoning codes and rules that are very often written by cities. So I wonder whether you can talk maybe a little bit about that from your experience.
Is that pointed back to me?
Maybe. Whoever knows.
John can add something later as well.
Boy, there's a few different things in there. So the fertilizer goes off-site. It also, some of it does stay on site. There's some planters and some food production at the building. Yeah, so I don't know. John Lancey has his hand up. Maybe you want to answer that, John.
Yeah, I would say it could be on site or off site very easily. of course, the most essential part is having the infrastructure in place to either store the urine or treat the urine on site, right? I was in Geneva a couple of months ago looking at a few different urine diversion systems. Really fascinating seeing all of the different approaches. Some were really high tech and sophisticated, and some were really like low technology, but still treating the urine to the point that it could be used as fertilizer. So there's like a lot of different approaches that you can use there. There's this one in Geneva that I was looking at. So all of the urine went through this piping system and went through this filter called the Petri bon. And from there it was pumped out, and you could use this garden hose and apply it around either in the garden near the building, or put it into a bucket and then take it to the garden that was just a small walk away. It was kind of like a car-free community eco district. Really, really nice place. Wasn't super surprised to see it there, to be honest, but but yeah, there's so many different approaches you can do. You can concentrate it, so you reduce the volume. You make transporting it a lot easier. I know the freeze concentration method is good for the, there's a ton of different methods for processing it to reduce the volume. So yeah, I would say both.
Maybe just a word, because you just mentioned Geneva, which is in Switzerland.
Yes.
I think it's true. There are a lot of technologies that we could use to treat the urine and use it. Maybe as long as you want to do it on site in your place and no one asks, that's okay. But I mean, if you want to do urine separation, let's say in the city, then it's getting trickier, and then you need the certification, something like that. You need to sell it in some way, and I think this is challenging. I think we have been lucky, or we are lucky in Switzerland. It's possible. So we have a fertilizer which is certified by the Swiss Agricultural Ministry. It would not be possible in Germany, because they have a positive list, and what is not on the positive list cannot be used as a raw material, as a fertilizer. Urine is not on the positive list. So I think this also shows that depending on where you are, you might have better options or not such good options. But I just saw there are two more hands raised. Maybe let's switch to Matthew first.
Yes, I wanted to, there's some questions in the chat about, is it a fertilizer? Is it a waste? And I wanted to say, when I'm using those terms, I'm often in my head thinking about these legal categories, right? Not what urine is or what it could be, but the very contingent process of how we get to the point of installing these and using these systems. And that is going to involve using existing rules and existing regulations that may not classify urine the way we want to think about it. But we should think about these regulatory processes as very contingent, and subject to flux and change. And as John was talking about, he needed the Bullitt Center to talk about the PAE building, right? And so right now at this stage, our most important practice is to get systems in the ground to point to. And those systems are going to be licensed all sorts of different ways. And so, yeah, I wanted to just step back and say that was how I'm sometimes using those terms. And it doesn't mean that I think it's a waste, or it's just, I think the waste rules are going to have to be used. So.
Thank you, Matthew. Robert, you have a question or comment?
Yes, just a comment about the situation in France. I'm collecting urine every day for now 5 years. And to answer the Alexandra question about the density, actually in Europe, we are allowed to apply 170 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare, per Yes, Hector. It's about 17 gram per square meter of nitrogen. And in equivalent of urine, it's about 2 liters per square meter that can be applied progressively, not in one shot, because you preferably follow the needs of the plants. And as an architect, you would need a lot of land for a large building. So it's not always realistic to use 100% of the collected urine in a building, because buildings are by nature full of people and with little land or balconies. I use it in my plants. I use it everywhere in the balcony, and it works perfectly. But the standard that you can look at is about 200 to 400 square meter of green land that you can fertilize per person.
Thank you, Robert. I just saw I'm just reading also the chat. I don't get everything in there. I'm too slow, but I saw the keyword PFAS. You know, PFAS, it's being discussed a lot at the moment, so I'm really switching the topic. Do you think that the whole discussion about PFAS will help the case of urine separation, or is it of any importance for us when it comes to the regulation of urine source separation, the reuse of urine? Who has an opinion on that? John?
I have just a few thoughts, not super technical or in depth, but in terms of concerns about toxicity within the urine, I think is what's really being raised here. You know, I can see where that's coming from. I think another consideration here is, does urine stand out as a unique source or concentration of pharmaceuticals? And the answer to that from various sources I've read is no, especially when you're comparing to animal agriculture, which as we know, the animals defecate and urinate within their space, and as far as other agricultural products being grown as well. So the animal agriculture is very heavy on the pharmaceutical side. There's factors like PFAS that are involved as well. So I would say, from my knowledge, when you're comparing it to other sources, that's probably less of a concern. Maybe someone else can weigh in on that as well.
Pat?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of link the previous question with this as well. I think ultimately we're talking about sort of market transformation, or just a change in how we do these things. So you have, from how I look at it, kind of two different sides. You have a product which is fertilizer that's being created from urine. Could that transform the market, right? If your costs are low, if you're transporting this far away from a building, so on and so forth, those are costs that negatively impact the ability to have a product transform the marketplace. You also have the cheap cost of fossil fuel or making industrialized fertilizer. Again, that's really difficult hurdle for recaptured urine to hit the marketplace and be a product that's going to transform the marketplace. Yeah. It's also sort of a niche product. So I don't really see products like the one that we're creating out of PAE or other products transforming the marketplace as much as I see from the regulatory point of view, whether that's PFAS, whether that's climate change, whether that's antiquated wastewater treatment plants, or other regulations that are going to sort of put another requirement on treating effluent or treating sewage to a higher standard, keeping nitrogen out of waterways, as the final disposal point of view, or
Mm.
you're in a place where you have land applied biosolids that cannot get to the groundwater, right? That all nutrients has to be stripped out of it. At that point, now you're starting to see, well, what can we do with those nutrients from the regulatory point of view? And the byproduct would then be these different retail or wholesale
Mm.
products. So that's kind of how I see sort of market transformation. So yes, regulations on what we do in the existing wastewater treatment side, I think is going to be the transformation.
Mhm, mhm. Matthew, you also wanted to add something on the topic.
I wanted to highlight the way John framed this, and I think that's very important whenever we're talking with regulators or the public about these issues, to always compare to the existing system, right? So where are pharmaceuticals entering the food system currently? Will this change dramatically change the current system in terms of exposure? And the other framing issue is about the point of intervention. And as much as we need to worry about PFAS, I think it's vital for us to say, well, if human contact with PFAS is an issue, then human urine is an indication that there's human contact with PFAS. That's not on the human excrement management side. That's not really our issue. That is on the human exposure side. And so it's a vital thing to track, but we can't get trapped when communicating about urine diversion in defending urine diversion against sort of popular myths of ideal disposal that currently exist. We always have to make that comparison to the real system and highlight where the point of intervention should be, because it's very easy, especially in regulatory conversations, to get into that defensive back and forth.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to highlight that.
Mhm, mhm. So when I make a first summary of our discussion, I see two directions. One is let's try to do it locally. You know, I mean, there are always some options. I mean, Pat, you mentioned the Oregon USDA. I mean, it's a regional state authority. You might have some contacts. You can get a certification for a certain fertilizer. We might get maybe Seattle and Portland, the cities were supportive of those lighthouse projects as well in some way. I mean, so it seems like that in this framework that we have today, there are already some ways to move forward and to get the things done in some way. So shall we go on in this way? I mean, but I mean, the challenge might be that you really need people who are very knowledgeable, who know how to work around certain regulations. Or would it be better to really target, let's say, US EPA, USDA, or maybe state officials, federal officials, and really tell them, hey, we have to change the way how we actually handle nutrients, wastewater, urine, and feces. What do you think? If we want to move forward with resource-oriented sanitation, with urine separation, how shall we move forward? What would be a good strategy? Maybe or Matthew. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up some of Recode's early history on this because Recode started attempting to get gray water and rainwater reuse in Oregon buildings and received pushback from the Department of Environmental Quality, and so went forward with a legislative process, and that threw at the feet of the Department of Environmental Quality an unfunded mandate to make new rules and enforce them, which made them very upset. And so we ended up with a excellent law and not particularly useful rules, because the rulemaking that happened was an antagonistic process.
Okay.
And so I think engaging on that larger conversation on how we're going to manage urine and structuring legislative change, I would love to see that. But when we're trying to make that change, I think it's vital to start talking to regulators at the lowest level, people who are doing system inspection and building a track record with those regulatory departments, so that when that rulemaking comes in, when the legislation is passed and the rulemaking happens, you have people who are excited to make useful rules and regulators who are interested in doing effective interpretation.
maybe there's also another aspect of rules and regulations. I mean, those are the plumbing codes, and it's not only about regulate, but also to help actually the people, the plumbers and so on, who install those systems. And this might actually be a question for John as well. I mean, especially John, I mean, you are working on this plumbing codes. I mean, not only also some others. Are the codes ready to be used by regular plumbers, or do we need some more work on that?
I would say again to that, yes, they are ready. Are they as detailed and helpful and well understood as our existing regulations and guidance on other systems? Not yet. There's some really good guidance out there from, like I mentioned yesterday, the Laufen installation manual, the Dutch NTR 3216 standard, and of course the WeStand, published by IATMO, which there's a new version coming out, which Pat and I worked on quite a bit over the past 2 years, updating. But yeah, as far as, design guidance regulation goes, yeah, we're ready to move forward with that. To be honest, I think one of the biggest hurdle is convincing someone that they need a urine diversion system or a nutrient recovery system. Because of course the best place to do this is in a new building. And to be honest, I would argue that concerns about cost are potentially a bigger issue than regulation. In fact, I wouldn't even say potentially, I would say they probably are. Because there are pathways for kind of proceeding forward, as has been demonstrated by some lighthouse projects. And if you can get all of the parties on board interested, and we can point to some of the work that Recode's done, WeStand, and in other areas where you can prove that this is a safe system, both on the plumbing side and the treatment side. I think everyone can get all on board, but the question, of course, and the environment of today, where almost all new construction is over budget, how can we justify adding this new strange system that few people have experience with? And that is a harder sell, and that again is why the architect, it's so important for them to be on board, so they can advocate for these systems. And in the end, the bottom line is a urine diversion system does not have to be more expensive than what we're already providing. Like I talked about yesterday, there's a lot of redundant piping in the system, at least in US buildings. That's the advantage that we have of such some outdated plumbing codes. There's a lot of redundant piping that is installed in the buildings, the vent piping that is provided on almost every fixture. We can literally swap that piping that would get installed out with a single stack drainage system approach, and provide all of that infrastructure that we need for a urine diversion system, whether we have treatment on site or off site. That's a separate question, but fundamentally we have to be able to divert the urine. As far as the water closets go, it was mentioned a little bit about some of those not having certifications yet. At the PAE Living building, we got water closets that didn't have the certifications needed for a typical plumbing fixture. They came from Norway, and that was because we presented these water closets, and these comply to European standards. They don't apply to you know, these don't qualify under US standards. Can we please use them? And when we tell them what we're doing, the answer is that, okay. So it of course depends on the jurisdiction that you're working in, right? But having a justified reason for doing what you're doing, and being able to work that into the pro forma for the building. You know, I think those are some of the biggest hurdles we face.
So plumbing codes, plumbing is apparently not the issue. And you said actually the costs are the issue, but now costs, they depend on the market as well. And the market also depends on some rules and regulations. When we talked about wastewater treatment and the cost of regulation, wastewater treatment, Pat, would you agree on that? That we need more regulation, changes in the regulation for wastewater treatment and the costs of wastewater treatment?
I'm gonna say yes. And I'm gonna skip over that actually. Because I think, and this is, I really wanted to follow up on what Matthew started and kind of where we're going in general. And I want to make sure we get that in. Because, you know, we learn from our mistakes. So having a process that's antagonistic in the regulatory side is, of course, not where we want to go. And what we're seeing today, and you see it codified in states like Oregon, Washington, California. There's other ones that have they have processes now that have to engage in community engagement in the rulemaking process, which is really, really critical, because those are the groups, those are the frontline communities, those are the typically the people that don't have power but have the short end of the stick, right? They're being impacted. All of these impacted communities then should be part of the rulemaking process. And that's kind of where, like, that's my work. That's my main work with Recode right now, is to engage groups like this group, right? That have a diverse perspective, footprint in general, and experiences that we can bring in to change those rules, to make it more equitable for everybody. And so by incorporating that process or those people into the rulemaking process, you could imagine it from a constituent point of view. If you have all of these communities all telling you the same thing, look, we have to make water more affordable, we have to make sanitation more affordable, we have to make our public health systems more equitable. Those are all linked together. Could you make those arguments for better regulation? Of course you can. And by making it for those most impacted, those most susceptible, you raise everybody's standards then. And so that's kind of the approach that we've been taking. And I'm going to kind of cue it up for Matthew then, because he's got a Google form that he put together in order to sort of lead that change for this next go around in regulations. Can I do that, Matthew? Am I putting you on the spot?
No, that's great. Thanks, Pat. Yeah, so I spammed all of your email this morning. So first of all, sorry for that. But yes, asking for people who want to co-sponsor moving We Stand Forward in the Uniform Plumbing Code to be an appendix to the Uniform Plumbing Code, and also to revisit the Recode Model Code and see if we can apply for it to be an appendix to the International Plumbing Code. That would go a long ways towards having uniform rules in the United States for these systems. And, you know, we're trying, as Pat was saying, we're trying to do an antagonistic process. We're working with industry. And one of the things that we've heard is that the people who work on codes want to hear from manufacturers. They want to hear that there's an industry here. And so if you work in designing fixtures, you'd like to be in the US market, or you are in the US market, or you design hardware or treatment systems, we would especially love you and your company to sign on as co-sponsors to this, to show that this is a burgeoning industry, and that these rules are necessary to start moving forward and be able to cost out and get regulatory certainty. So.
And this actually also answers one of my questions: how can we get engaged? I mean, this is one way to get engaged. I mean, it also means that, like this group, as we are here, you know, we actually can, if we work together, we might influence the codes as well. I would like to, we have a couple of minutes left. I would like to come back to the costs, because John, you raised this issue. Alexandra, you're nodding as well. I mean, those new sanitation systems, they are costly, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is also, you know, at least here in Switzerland, Europe, and so on. I mean, you have to connect to the sewer. I mean, there are costs connected to that. You know, in Geneva, John, you mentioned Geneva, some of the projects there, some of the houses with alternative sanitation, they don't have to pay the fees for the wastewater. I mean, this is a big advantage. Can we work with this kind of regulation? How can we influence this kind of regulation to really produce a market for this new sanitation technologies? Are there any ideas for the US? John.
So one thing that I'm coming back to is just thinking about San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Sacramento, which all passed ordinances requiring drainage separation in the building for recycling that. So that's a requirement that has to be implemented. It's just considered part of the design process, part of the building process, just like anything else. We separate stormwater from sanitary drainage in buildings. No one really questions that during the design process. It's how it's done. It's how we've always done it. And we're starting to see that done with this. So, you know, I think actually requiring it in buildings is essential at some point. I don't think that we're quite there yet, probably, because we don't have enough lighthouse projects. So right now, the challenge is, how do we get this on a project? How do we get someone who's willing to pay the cost? And like I mentioned before, I would not say a urine diversion system has to be any more expensive than a regular building. And that's comes from, you know, careful planning and the location of the fixtures. Most buildings are not laid out well in terms of where the fixtures are concentrated. They're kind of dispersed throughout the building. You know, if you concentrate that, you can cut the amount of piping used in the building in half. So that covers the cost already. And of course, you know, utilizing the almost ventless single stack drainage system, that again cuts the cost in half. So those are a lot of cost saving measures. An objective that you have for incorporating into your building, you can make it happen without it costing more necessarily.
Great. It's 10:30, so we are basically done. Although, I mean, there will be so many interesting topics to follow up on that. I think maybe just to make a very short summary, I think regulation, it can be a problem, but I mean, there are ways how to deal with that. This can be the grassroots initiatives, you know, that were presented by Matthew and Pat, but they're also like on a local level, they're usually a way how to deal with those regulations and to implement the system. So, I mean, so I go home or I stay here with a really good feeling that, I mean, there are ways to move forward, even if the regulation might not be in place completely yet. This is good. I think for me, at least, the conclusion is, I think what we didn't discuss so much in the end was the whole regulation about the wastewater, you know, and I think this is something we didn't really discuss so much. And I think there's still a lot to do. You know, I mean, just open up this regulation, at least in Europe. You know, it's really, really designed for centralized sewer-based sanitation systems. I would assume it might be similar in the US. I don't know. And I think this, for me at least, this is the main topic for regulation at the moment. Okay. Other very short, I just want to give the opportunity for very short statements to the panelists, if there are any at the moment. If not, thank you to everyone. I think this was a really good discussion. And looking forward to the rest of the conference and the summit.
Thank you, Kai.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.